2 years ago. And so that then my talk was about recent discoveries about migratory bird ecology using radar and telemetry. So I want to talk about even more recent discoveries.
I just wonder if you should be closer to yours.
Can you all hear me on the Zoom?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sit. Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I will sit. Okay. So what I want to talk to you tonight about is some recent work that we're doing in my lab and also colleagues of mine that use radar and telemetry to track birds during migration. And as a refresher, let's see here, I gotta get the slide. I suspect nowadays most people are familiar with, using radar to see birds during migration. I think the Birdcast website, Cornell's Birdcast website, has really helped popularize the notion that we use radar to monitor bird migration. So this is our weather radar network here in the US. We are lucky to have a very comprehensive radar network. I have colleagues in other countries in Europe, and they don't have such a nice system or a coordinated system to be able to look at migration at a continental scale. Essentially, you can see, across the continental US here. And they've been operating since 1995 and storing all that data since then. So we're now going on almost 30 years of data. We claim it's one of the largest biological data sets in existence. It's over 3 petabytes in size of the data archive. And of course, we think the W in the WSR-88D, that's the name of the model. They were commissioned in 1988 is when they started putting the radars out. We think it stands for wildlife because we see a lot more wildlife than we see weather on the radars. And so this is just a loop that's looping through a fall in 2010 here. And you might recognize, some of the weather patterns, the precipitation, that's the greens and yellows that are kind of moving across the country. And then all those little blue flashes around the radar sites, kind of these little blue donut looking images, that is birds migrating at night, right? And most of it's happening in the eastern half of the US. But that's what nocturnal bird migration looks like on these radars when you have access to the unfiltered data. And of course, it's a great tool for monitoring birds because most birds are migrating at night when it's hard to be able to see them. I think the statistic is 40% of the world's 10,000 or so bird species are migratory. And here in North America, it's 70% of the bird species are migratory, and 80% of those are migrating at night. And so again, this is kind of a refresher here to show which bird groups migrate at night. So most of our songbirds are migrating at night. Our waterfowl, shorebirds, waders, they're all nocturnal migrants. And the few diurnal migrants that we have include the pelicans. We've got raptors, swallows like the martins are day migrants. Some of the corvids, there's some flycatchers that also migrate during the day. But most of them are migrating at night. And I suspect a lot of folks are familiar with the Birdcast website. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, since 2018, they have used those weather radar observations going back to the early 90s to be able to model across the US conditions, to be able to predict the intensity of bird migration on a nightly basis. And so they can use those models that they've built to be able to forecast bird migration as well. So this was the forecast for last night. And what you might not know is that there's another website at the Colorado State University. So Kyle Horton, who helped develop the birdcast, he has developed in his lab, they've been working on these maps that have some more basically finer spatial detail in where birds are migrating. So the birdcast data, they essentially are just interpolating the amount of migration in between the radar stations. But out of Kyle Horton's lab, they've been able to build models that are modeling that spatial variability of bird migration. And so you get a much more detailed picture of the intensity of migration. And you might see a couple areas. Let's see if I can point on the screen here. Cursor. So here's the city of Houston. You can see that's kind of bright, and we've got Baltimore and DC are kind of bright. Any guesses as to why that might be?
Light.
Yeah, light pollution. So they found in their models that birds are drawn to light pollution, and so we do tend to see higher intensity of bird migration over cities. So they tend to light up.
What's a bird migration? Yeah.
Well, that's just very high bird migration, but you can see it's higher around some of these cities that pop out than sort of the surrounding areas because they attract birds due to the light pollution. But anyway, you can get these maps. These aren't on Birdcast, although I imagine it's just a matter of time before they will be posting these forecasts. But that's the link there if you go to Kyle Horton's lab. And I think they just started producing them. Maybe last year was last year I think was the first year they started.
Remember I wanted to go in person to this?
Yeah.
Whoops, what happened?
Is somebody not muted?
Yeah, I think so. And so back in 2022, the theme for World Migratory Bird Day was light pollution, right? The idea was dimming the lights for birds at night. And that stems from some of the work that we've been doing in my lab, our understanding of how light pollution impacts birds. And but I'm gonna circle back around to the theme of World Migratory Bird Day for this year later, which is actually, I think it's this weekend, this Saturday, the 11th, is World Migratory Bird Day. So this is just kind of zooming in here to show you what nocturnal migration, the onset of nocturnal migration shortly after sunset looks like on radar. This is the Dover, Delaware radar. And I'm just showing you this because it's pretty obvious in this imagery. The more intense colors, the yellows, right, are kind of, these are birds emerging, and they're basically up and down the I-95 corridor from Baltimore to Philadelphia, you can see. And of course, there are a lot of birds in southern New Jersey because they tend to accumulate there on the Cape May Peninsula. But even smaller cities like Dover, you can see, and this is Rehoboth down here in southern Delaware, and Annapolis even, you can see there's more intensity right around these urban areas. So last time I talked to you a little bit about this research that we had done back in 2018. This was the first paper where we kind of presented this evidence using weather radar data to show that migrating birds are attracted to light pollution at a very broad spatial scale. And so here I'm showing you what sky glow looks like. We measured the amount of sky glow around these cities, and we use this just the most intense, brightest lights are what we call bright sky glow. So if you're familiar with the Bortle scale, that's just this, the astronomers use this to measure the sort of the brightness of the sky. That's the most intense light that you basically see in the largest cities. And we looked at the relationship between bird stopover density, the density of the birds where they stop while they're migrating, that we quantify when they leave their stopover habitats on the radar, and this proximity to bright light and controlling for a lot of other things that we know affect bird densities in these habitats. And we found this relationship here where as you get closer to these very bright urban areas, bird density increases quite dramatically. And that study was done just using a few radars here in the northeastern US. And just in December, we published another paper. So Kyle Hort and I are co-authors, we worked together on this project. And I always joke with him that he just 100% everything. He like just does everything. So he was like, well, I'll map stopover across the whole US. I'm like, okay, great. So he did it because he had already done it with bird migration, when birds are flying through the night. So he used our sort of approach to model where birds are stopping over. And so we now have this sort of across the contiguous US, these stopover maps of where birds are stopping over. And of course, we modeled these relationships. So these are the sort of the model predicted sort of distribution of birds during fall across the US. And the second most important variable was sky glow. So that's why that's actually the title of the paper, light pollution is the top predictor of bird stopover density. And so just to run through a little number, so we have 143 radars in the contiguous US. So we analyzed data from 143 radars from a 5-year span, 2016 to 2020. And our spring stretch from March 15 to June 15th. And our fall migration, we use data from August 15th to November 15th. So pretty wide time window there. And we ended up processing over 3 million radar scans. And I forget how many sort of pixels of data we have. It's tens of millions. And we built these models. So I like to say this is like a good use of artificial intelligence, right? Like some of the models that we're building, and just we use artificial intelligence to discern, to pull out the biology from the meteorology in the radar data. And so we built these models and had like 49 different predictor variables, things like various land cover types, temperature, precipitation, year, sky glow, elevation. And like I said, the sky glow, and actually the way we did this is because when you try to model stuff at a continental scale, that's a really large sort of area, and relationships between the birds and these different land cover types and things can change across the country, right? Like what's pine forest in the east is very different than pine forest out in Western US, and different species of birds in different places. So what we did is we built these little model frames. So they're 400 kilometers square, and we covered the US with 2,000 of them. I only drew a couple. But you get the idea. We had all these modeling frames across the US, and we built models for each of those modeling frames. And then we sort of aggregate all that information later. But that allows us to capture variability in relationship between birds and these predictor variables throughout the country. And despite that, so this is sort of summarizing across all our 2,000 models, sky glow in the fall was the second most important variable. And for 74% of those modeling frames, it had a strong positive effect where birds are being drawn to light. So these are the maps and here's the map for spring on the left. So showing you where birds are concentrating. And so it's interesting that the southeastern US in the fall seems to be where we get the highest densities of birds. kind of where the Appalachian Mountains converge with the Mississippi River. A lot of birds are moving along those sort of features. So like northern Alabama and Tennessee are probably really good places to go birding in the fall. And then what you see below that is, because we're usually, a lot of the research that we do we focus on its conservation applications. So what you see on the bottom are these three colors depicting sort of like the relative migrant density. So the reds are the very high areas in the top 10 percentile of bird density. The medium are the yellow, so just above average, and the gray are just below average. But the way we sort of classify these things is using this moving window. So you see that circle in the center, that's depicting the typical distance that a bird will fly in a given night is about 265 kilometers, which I think we got from some telemetry data. So we kind of move that window across the country so that we can classify kind of what we're calling regional hotspots, right? Like within the distance that a bird might fly in a given night, right? And the idea is that they need these like stepping stones every night to go along the way. And that's just to help us kind of identify these hotspots. And so if you're curious, I zoomed in here to our region, kind of centered on Chester County. And so, so maybe you're familiar with some of these areas. Things are, hopefully this might make sense to you all if you're like, because I do see like in the fall's on the right, like French Creek State Park pops up as a hot spot. But of course, so does most of the Delmarva. And I think this is because we capture a lot of waterfowl migration. And there are a lot of snow geese that overwinter on the Delmarva Peninsula. And since we go to like November 15th, we're picking up some of their early movements. But yeah, and then in the spring, again, we have, this is like the city of Baltimore here, and surrounding it, you know, we have these hotspots in the suburbs of Baltimore and suburbs of Washington, D.C. Are lighting up again, likely because of that attraction to light pollution, which is interesting. And in fact, one of the conclusions that we drew from this study is that these peri-urban illuminated areas, i.e. suburbia, right, may act as ecological traps at macro scales that increase the mortality of birds during migration. So we're really concerned that we're drawing birds into these places, these urban parks and suburban areas, but that they might be ecological traps, meaning they're getting exposed to sort of these anthropogenic sources of mortality, right? So kind of the line of evidence here is that we have evidence that birds are drawn to the light pollution when they're flying. We know they also then will stop over in these urban areas. And because of that, they're probably being exposed to greater risks of dying from various things. Like the two big ones are glass and cats, right? So it's estimated upwards of 1 billion birds die every year to collision with glass, and up to 4 billion birds are getting killed by cats every year. Basically by monitoring birds, like bird collisions at buildings, and like mortality rates of cats, and then estimating how many cats are in the landscape. And sort of, it's an extrapolation, but it's based on observations of mortality rates. Yeah, question.
So Alabama, I can't imagine why the Nashville, Birmingham, Montgomery border, I mean, are those steel plants in Birmingham, or Huntsville is in there
Yeah,
as well?
like why they're hotspots?
No,
Or
what's so much generating maple?
oh, well, the reason there are a lot of birds there isn't because those are large cities per se. It's that that's just kind of where these flyways converge. There's a lot of forested habitat there. It's a nice place to stop if you're a bird. But yeah, there are definitely like, these, I think light pollution has a lot to do with why this area around Baltimore and Washington, D.C. kind of lights up as a hot spot in the spring. And that is probably due to the lights. Like, I don't have it in here, but I have a really nice image of like all these birds flying out of Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. And in Philadelphia, Fairmount Park, it has higher bird densities than Cape May, New Jersey, like in the fall. Oh, yeah. So, and again, because the birds are kind of packing in there, maybe that's why there's a Swainson's warbler in downtown Philly. Maybe he got drawn in by the lights. And recently there was this really nice study that kind of helped connect the dots between light pollution and building collisions. So a colleague of ours, Ben Van Doren, led this research using bird collision monitoring data at the McCormick Place Conference Center in downtown Chicago. Biologists at the Field Museum since 2000 had been like walking the McCormick Place building daily to collect dead birds and recording how many birds they've collected. Over 11,000 birds over the past 20 years. And they also recorded information because McCormick Place doesn't always leave its lights on all night long. Which lights are on changes over the years and from day to day and that sort of thing. And so they were able to record how many lights were on at the McCormick Place. And using radar data, so over on the right, it's showing you the intensity of bird migration for all the 20 years that they looked at for both spring and fall migration. And it's just telling you every night how many birds are flying through the region to help control for, traffic rates, because it's likely you're going to get more collisions on nights when there are more birds flying, right? And so, and there were other variables that they kind of had to control for to really isolate the effect of the lights per se, rather than just, the weather or how much migration was happening, or the plot over here on the right is the strength of the east-west winds. And so what they found was when the wind is blowing more out of the east, it pushes more birds off the lake and towards Chicago, and they'll get higher mortality when there's stronger east winds, higher mortality when there's just more birds migrating, and also higher mortality when the fraction of all those glass bay windows are lit up. And in fact, what they found was just having the amount of lit window area would decrease collisions by 11-fold in the spring and 6-fold in the fall. So they found a really nice, there's a strong relationship between the amount of light on that building and how many birds are flying. Okay, so, and there's some good news, I guess, right? That, different strokes for different species, but not all species are attracted to light pollution. And that might not be good for them, just because that's something that just keeps growing. I think we're growing at a rate of like 4% per year in the amount of light pollution. So whippoorwills, there was a study done. I had colleagues that were put GPS telemetry tags on whippoorwills and to track their migrations. And what this is showing you is the track of a couple birds here, sort of negotiating Houston, Texas, on the Texas coast. And the orange are the paths of the birds, and the orange dots are sort of where they were while they're flying. The white dots are where they stopped over in between flights. And what they found was the colors here depicting the amount of dark sky connectivity. So the darker the area, basically the darker that the sky is, right? And that you can move stay within a dark sky as you move through the landscape. And the brighter it is, the blue and the white just means there's more light pollution, and you can pretty well see, it looks like these birds are seeking out those dark sky corridors and trying to avoid the lights. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about some research that we're doing here locally. And I talked a little bit about it a couple of years ago, but we were kind of right in the thick of data collection and hadn't really yet analyzed anything. But we've been studying purple martins in northern Delaware and southern Chester County over at the Bucktoe Preserve, is one of our colonies. And this is work that's been sponsored by Delaware Audubon, and these are folks that have collaborated on this project. And we've also gotten some funding from the Purple Martin Conservation Association. And it's just a nice collaboration between University of Delaware, Delaware Nature Society, Delaware Audubon. And what we're interested in doing is looking at post-breeding movement. So at the end of the summer, looking at the movement of adults and juveniles, they tend to form these large, it's kind of hard to see in the image, but there's hundreds of purple martins here in the sky. They're going to roost. These are what these communal roosts look like on radar in the morning when the martins are leaving the roost at sunset or sunrise. But anyway, they form these communal roosts, and then eventually they'll migrate, right? So this is kind of after they're breeding, before they leave for migration, they're using these communal roosts, and every day, thousands of birds are kind of coalescing in these roosts. And so we were using both weather radar to look at the roosts on the radar, but also radio telemetry to see these birds that are coming from these local colonies, and how much are they moving around from roost to roost? Do they just use one roost and then they leave? Or are they using them all? Are adults and juveniles moving at the same time, or are there differences in their timing of departure from the region? And for the telemetry part, we're using the Modus Wildlife Tracking System. And this was developed, forget when it really got started, in the early 2010s. It hasn't been around all that long. I guess about a decade, a little over a decade now. But Bird Studies Canada really got the ball rolling. They started some work at Long Point Bird Observatory, just across the way from on Lake Erie is where it kind of got started. But they're now up to almost 2,000 receiver stations, and it's global, right? I'm just showing you here in North America. It's in 34 countries. They've tagged like 45,000 animals, not just birds, but they're tagging, bats and mammals and insects. And so we contribute, all those yellow dots are these automated receiving towers that can basically detect these tags when birds fly near them. And we set up some of these towers here again, like in southern Chester County and northern Newcastle County in Delaware. And we put up these receiver towers. Those are the yellow dots. So like at Longwood Gardens, we have one, it's still there. Delaware Museum of Nature and Science, it's still there. There's a tower. This is the tower that we put up near London Grove. But we put up these towers, and these colors are just showing you kind of like overlapping coverage of these towers. So the idea was we were going to try to triangulate the locations of these birds as they're flying around. And we had three breeding colonies, one at Bucktoe Creek Preserve, one at Ashland Nature Center in Delaware, and one at Curtis Mill Park, which is in Newark, Delaware. And we were monitoring the breeding activity of birds at these colonies. So this work happened in the summers of 2020 through 2022. And we put out we tagged 92 juveniles and 86 adults. So I guess that adds up to 178 purple martins across these 3 colonies. Using 2 different types of tags. The one in the bottom right is what's called a life tag. It's solar powered. It only works when it's receiving sunlight. But for diurnally active birds, that works pretty well. And then we kind of just drew, and basically the birds wear these like a fanny pack. It kind of goes around their legs, and they wear it on their back, on their rump, the tag. And so this is Katie Bird. She was the master student on the project, getting nestlings out of gourds to put tags on them. And this is Ian Stewart. So he was our master bander who had got all the permits and has all the expertise to put the tags on. And so, yeah, we got like over 32 million detections of our birds. So lots of data to do work with. So what I'm going to walk you through is just sort of the breeding season phenology here for purple martins. So you'll see like these little box plots here. There's just showing you kind of the range of dates for each sort of stage of the phenology. So this first stage, we're looking at the first adults arriving to the colonies. When do they start arriving? The median date was April 16th. And you'll see a number here. That's just like how many birds or how many nests we have to calculate that. So yeah, we start with birds coming back, and we got that from radio tagged birds that we tagged in one season and they returned the next season. We could get the timing of when they came back to their colonies. And purple martins spend about a month and a half just hanging out. Right? I guess, some of them are still coming on migration, still arriving to their colonies, but it takes them about 44 days before they start laying eggs. So that's the first egg laying date is about May 30th. So come the end of the month, that's when half the martins will have their first eggs laid. So they're doing courtship, they're building nests in this month and a half, but it takes them a while to kind of get going. But May 30th is kind of when these nests really start. They lay their eggs, 19 days to incubate. Not a whole lot of variability in that. So the median hatching day is June 18th. Then it takes about a month for those nestlings to fledge from the nests. So here we're at about the middle of July is when they're going to start. The young will be leaving the nest. And we were able to determine like how soon after they fledge do they kind of leave their colony. It doesn't take long. 3 days is like the median or the mean time from when they leave their nest to when they kind of leave the colony and start exploring the areas around their colonies. And then we're sort of in this pre-migration stage where both the adults and the juveniles, again, they're just kind of hanging out for another month and a half. And they are going to these large communal roosts and just foraging every day, leaving these roost sites every day, but they're kind of staying in the area. So that's what we call this pre-migration stage. And then the median date for when they kind of depart the region and really head south for migration, like head down to, Virginia and North Carolina and leave the region, is at the end of August. And we did find a difference between the juvenile and adults. So the adults tend to leave first, about 2 weeks ahead of the juveniles. And I think it ranged. So the adults leave for migration anytime between 19 and 46 days after their nests fledge. And it takes the juveniles, they stick around from 26 to 68 days. So 51 days on average. And the adults, it was 37 days. So there's like almost a 2 week difference there, which is kind of cool. So So if you go to Modus has this cool website where you can see all the data and you can see tracks of birds, and these are what they call a timeline that shows you basically here's all the hours of the day, and every day is kind of a row here, but it just shows you like when it's detecting different birds. Well, actually, this is one bird that is being detected at different towers. So this is all the colors are different towers, and the green one is its home colony tower. I think this was a bucktoe bird. So all these detections over here between the hours of 0 and 10 are like in the night. And actually, this was the second type of tag. We had hybrid tags that had a battery and a solar panel, so they'd work 24 hours a day. But all this activity is during the day over here on the right. But this is its activity after, let's see, I think it fledged on the 11th of July. So this is it moving around kind of locally. That's what all of these are. So these maps are just basically connecting the dots between when it gets detected at one tower and then it gets detected at the next tower. But this is its pre-migration activity. So it spent some time in the general area, but then it started using these large communal roosts. I'll show you where some of these are here. And it pretty much used all of them in the mid-Atlantic. Before then it left for migration and it actually got detected on this offshore rig. It's like 40 kilometers offshore from Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is kind of cool. But let's dig a little bit more into the data on this one bird. So we were able to triangulate the actual locations of the bird in the air. So all these yellow dots are where we estimated the bird was at one point, during its time. And the little red circles are kind of the error in our estimates. So you can see some of them are quite large, others are smaller, but these are all points that have an error of at least 10 kilometers or less. There's about 14,000 of them. But this bird had over 152,000 total detections. And this is showing you, most of those are single tower detections. It gets detected at one tower at a time, but we do have, I think, 18,000 multi-tower detections. So at least 2, 3, 4, 5, even up to 6 towers were detecting this bird at the same time, so that we can then triangulate its position. So yeah, spending time at, there's a roost down here in Southern Maryland. This is where it was around its colony. But then we thought we could kind of merge this with the radar data. So this is radar data. This is like in August 21st of 2022 in the morning. And these are kind of like the local communal roosts here in the sort of mid-Atlantic region. So there's one at Aberdeen Proving Ground. This is one at Maurice, on the Maurice River in New Jersey. They actually do like a boat tour. You can go see it. That's a pretty consistent one. This is the Atlantic City one. It's near Atlantic City. And what's interesting is all these roosts appear to be, we tried to confirm the location of some of these. We confirmed some of them, but not all of them. But they seem to be islands within rivers. So like the Maurice River, it's technically on an island that's on the river. And like this one is, the Atlantic City one is like on the Bass River. This is like the Chop Tank. I think this is the Nanticoke River, but they have this affinity for these little islands on rivers just here. In other places like in Oklahoma, I've been to roost. It's a Bradford pear tree in front of a church in downtown Tulsa. And there's like 10,000 martins in like 2 Bradford pear trees. It's pretty crazy. So they do have some urban roosts too. But these red dots are 3 of the towers that we've sort of affiliated with, these radio towers that we've affiliated with these roosts. Just because as the birds fly out, they'll well, at least if they go in this direction, they'll fly over those towers. And this bird actually, oh, and the other thing is this purple line here is depicting what I'm calling offshore. So that's 18 kilometers off the coast. essentially, if you're like 25 meters in the air, that's how far you can see to the horizon. It's about 18 kilometers. So once you're out that far, you can no longer see land if you're close to the water. Okay, so back to this one bird. So it fledged on July 11th. This is its colony here in the Bucktoe Preserve. And then it sort of departed the natal colony area, like it kind of left finally its colony on the 26th of July and started visiting these communal roosts. And so the first time we picked it up here was on August 1st. We picked it up at this tower, and we assume it was using the Maurice River roost because that's the roost closest to the tower. We picked it up in the morning, right? And this is the yellow here is the extent of the radar image of the birds leaving that roost on that morning. And you can see they extend beyond that 18-kilometer sort of range. Then we picked it up 5 days later up here at the Atlantic City roost. And this was the radar image from that day of when it left and pinged this tower. And the Atlantic City roost, those birds, that distance is like 50 kilometers. They're going way offshore every day. That's their daily commute. And they're probably going even further than that. That's just when they disappear off the radar. And to be able to see the birds 50 kilometers out from the radar, they are at about 3 kilometers up in the air. So they're really high up in the air. They're flying way out over the ocean, which is really interesting behavior.
And what are they doing? Do they come back then?
And they come back every day. Yeah, so the bird was here on August 1st. Then we picked it up here on the 6th. Then we picked it up on the 14th, all the way down here at the Virginia Beach roost. And it pinged this offshore tower. Oh, and I should say, also, it might be a little hard to see here. It says 6 birds detected. So there were 6 other birds that we tagged that were using that roost that year. The Atlantic City roost we picked up 10 of our birds that year. The Virginia Beach, that offshore tower actually picked up 3 of our birds that year. And so then on August 14th, it was down here. So it started here, went up here, went down here. Then it came back up to the Pocomoke River roost near Chincoteague Island. That's where the tower is. And again, every day you can see like this orange, the birds, they flew way out over the ocean before they disappeared off the radar. And what's interesting is this bar chart up here said the purple bars are showing you how many of our tagged birds are visiting the Atlantic City roost. This is just from the Atlantic City. So kind of the phonology of when they're there, it ranges from August through September. And the yellow line is showing you how large that roost is on the radar during that time as well. So the radar peak coincides with the peak of when our telemetry birds are using those roosts. And then they start to dissipate as you get into September, because all the birds start leaving the region. So it seems like these roosts are all kind of local birds. And they're just moving around to all these different roosts. So this is that Virginia Beach roost. This is a different radar. This is a radar down in Virginia. But here's the emergence here. The day this bird was picked up at that tower, and it was picked up right around the time that the radar showed the birds reached the tower there. So again, these birds, they're flying at least 50 kilometers or more out over the ocean every day. Like that's just their normal commute. And then they come back and then they fly out again the next day. So that is kind of a question that we have from this is, and I've asked, my colleagues, I'm like, well, it's clear they're flying really far out over the ocean on the radar. Like, what are they doing out there? And nobody really has they must be foraging on something, right? They're getting insects out there. But that's what's kind of interesting is what are the insects that they might be finding? And so then we did a little digging. So these are all the eBird observations of martins offshore beyond 18 kilometers from the coast, going back to 1977. and there are only 20 of them. So it's not, yeah, they're not seen commonly out on the ocean. And most of the observations are coming from pelagic birding trips. They're just seeing them while they're out offshore. But some of them are really out there. Like this one out here is like, I mean, they're out off the continental shelf. And the timing, and these are the sort of showing you when the birds are being seen out over the ocean. Again, it's during this, well, it's actually during the summer, there's some observations out there, but they tend to peak again during August and September, that peak sort of time when they're using these large communal roosts. And it's interesting because a lot of them, I don't know, I'm sure it has to do with where pelagic trips are run, but there's a lot here in the mid-Atlantic. But there's also some down here in Florida as well.
Yeah, that's changing. We lost one of our main pelagic, I do a lot of pelagic.
Okay.
I'm leaving tomorrow for this. We lost a lot of our mid-Atlantic pelagic, boat opportunities. Yeah, one guy retired. I am at Harris several times a year. And aside from the fact that they might be busy doing, the birds might be busy doing something else in July, we're generally not running a lot of pelagics during July, because it's not a great time for the seabirds, right? So there's definitely, like, the second half of May, we're running a big birding blast. Like, they're going every day for about 2 weeks, right? And then there's a couple in the beginning of June, and then there's like none for 3 weeks. So
and we don't see any in the spring. Like this is the only time of year. So these are just any observations offshore purple martins. Of course, they're really only here spring through the fall, but they're kind of being seen, you know, through the summer, but they really do peak at the end of the summer, which is interesting.
There's another black.
Yeah.
In August, and then there's several weekends in a row in September, and then they kind of dribble off. And
yeah, imagine it gets too cold and miserable to go.
Yeah, even though from Harris, it's only 2 hours to the Gulf Stream. It's, yeah, it can be pretty miserable. Plus, it gets to be hurricanes.
Well, yeah, there's that too. Oh, oops. So those are all the offshore eBird observations of purple martins. And I think the mean distance of those observations is like 77 kilometers. They range all the way up to, like, this one's that really far one's 282 kilometers offshore. And there are a handful of other swallows that are seen too, like tree swallows and barn swallows. But so anyway, on your pelagic trips, keep an eye out for swallows. For just
Data on where like sargassum beds are roaming around, because
I don't know.
like, I'm involved with seabird research. We take the tagging in Maine and Galapagos.
Okay.
Birds go all over. So Leach's swarm peppers were tagging, and they like to work the floating beds of kelp, which would be hatching bugs, maybe, right?
I don't know. Well, yeah, we don't know if they're feeding on aquatic insects or if it's just terrestrial insects that are blowing offshore. Are we running out of time?
No, I wanted to see if there's, summarize that, and there's a chat.
Oh, okay. There's someone on the chat.
Yeah,
Sorry.
they can't hear the question.
Yes, please repeat the questions. Okay.
Aquatic insects versus.
Aquatic insects are going to be insects that live their larval stages in water, like dragonflies and mosquitoes and mayflies and midges. And then they emerge as adults and they're flying as adults. But it's interesting because I was trying to find, like, back in the 1960s, there were a bunch of entomologists that went out on these ocean vessel cruises, like, to observe what insects are out there over the open ocean. And they did find, like, flies and beetles and things that were flying out way offshore. And maybe they're just really easy pickings because they can't really alight on the water. So maybe the insects get exhausted and then they're just easy to catch. I don't know. But clearly there's a benefit to flying very far offshore to forage, or the birds wouldn't be doing it. But anyway, that's kind of a mystery. So this is where our birds are going. So all those blue lines are purple martins. The other colors are different species that just show up on our, that we're pinging our towers. But we had just a handful of birds that we were able to track. Like they basically go down the Atlantic coast and through Florida and then hop across the Caribbean into Central America. So we had detections in Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, and most of these birds are eventually getting down into Brazil. That's where they overwinter. But there's really no towers down there. So, but that was great that we're able to see kind of where some of these birds are going. So then, I do want to kind of wrap up here soon. But if you want to hear more about how we are using the MODIS network to track birds here in the Delmarva Peninsula, Shelley Eshelman, she's a PhD student in my lab, on the 15th, if you want to venture down into Delaware, the Delaware Ornithological Society, several students in my lab are giving the presentation that night on May 15th at the Ashland Nature Center. But she's going to be talking about some of the MODIS telemetry work she's doing with towhees, and she's done some work with bobolinks here in southern Chester County. And so back to this World Migratory Bird Day. So, you know, we were talking about these insects that purple martins are eating, and the theme for this year is protect insects, protect birds. So that's a fitting theme because we do actually, this is Claire Bernard. She's a undergraduate senior thesis. She's doing a senior thesis research project. In fact, she's defending it later this week. But she's been looking at the purple martin diet and trying to see how that affects nestling development. And she's looking at two of the colonies we were using, Curtis Mill and Bucktoe, and then also the colony at Longwood Gardens. And because we had made some observations, because we did Longwood Gardens wanted us to tag some of their birds, and Katie noticed that those birds were really kind of small and emaciated compared to the other birds. And so we got kind of interested to see what's going on with these Longwood Gardens birds. So Claire was collecting fecal samples from nestlings throughout the summer at these colonies, and we use what's called metabarcoding. It's essentially we can process the DNA in the fecal samples and figure out what they've been eating. We can identify the insects they're eating from the fecal samples. And then she was weighing the chicks and looking at their development. And sure enough, we found Longwood Garden birds the nestlings are smaller. So they start out about 50% smaller than birds from these other two colonies. And then they end up, like, by the time they fledge, they're about 30% smaller. But I'm not going to give away the whole story if you want to find out what she found out about what they eat, because there are some interesting differences. You can hear her talk.
Is she giving a talk?
Yeah, it's on Zoom too. If you go to the DOS website, they have details.
DOS doesn't normally do Zoom.
Yeah, we are doing Zoom
Oh, really?
now, yeah. But I don't know if they make the Zoom link public.
Because I'm a member of DOS, but.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna do it's gonna be like a hybrid talk,
Oh, good.
like we're doing here. So if you're interested, email me and I can send you the Zoom. Because Shelley and Claire are talking. So the last thing I want to mention is a new project that just got started this spring here in Franklin County, PA, at the Letterkenny Army Depot. The Pennsylvania Game Commission is trying to reintroduce Northern Bobwhite to Pennsylvania. And we estimate that they were extirpated in the early 2000s. There are no quail, like wild quail, in Pennsylvania anymore. Same thing in New Jersey. They were extirpated from New Jersey around that time. This spring, this was one of the releases. They captured wild quail from Virginia, Kentucky and Tall Timbers Research Station in Florida. We had 87 birds that were translocated, and we put tags on 74 of them, radio tags. And these are two of our new grad students, Kai and Grace. So they're doing the research there at Letterkenny. They're there right now looking for bird nests because we're also monitoring grassland birds there. And we're going to be tracking eastern meadowlarks, yellow-breasted chats, and eastern towhees. But this was them releasing some quail, and these are what the tags look like. They kind of wear them as like a necklace, like a little pendant that goes around the neck. And, you know, I should say Northern Bobwhite is probably one of the most studied bird species for probably at least 50 years. They've been doing radio tracking studies on quail, but what's different now is that we have these automated telemetry arrays. And so this is the array at Letterkenny, and it's the largest array of what we call nodes. So that little box on the left, it's just a little radio receiver that has this little omnidirectional antenna. All it just knows is how strong the signal is. It doesn't have any information about direction of the tag from the node. But all those little triangles are places where we've put nodes up on the depot. There's like 300 of them. And they're spaced about 100 meters apart. And the idea is that when you get multiple detections on these nodes, they, you know, report the signal strength of the tag, and that can tell us how far the bird, you know, we get an estimate of how far the bird might be from a particular node. And when we get nodes that are close to each other, we can essentially triangulate or trilaterate the location of the bird in between the nodes based on kind of where our estimates of how far they are from the nodes lines up. So we've been doing that. And these are, this is from March 20th. We had 58 birds tagged at the time. Every color is a different bird. And this is showing you in sort of half-hour steps throughout the day where all those birds are on the base, and all through the night as well. So that's another thing that's a little different with these automated telemetry systems is we're getting information through the night, right? Because in the past, people had to hand track and they can't run around at night. Well, sometimes they do, but they don't really do, they wouldn't really do that for quail very much. But so when it's gray, the background's gray, that's at night. So yeah, there's like midnight on the base. And then and now we're down to 22 birds. We have 30% of our birds left here after about 2 months, which is not unexpected. There's a lot of mortality in the quail, but that's generally the kind of survival we usually see after about a year is 30%. So we have been able to find some predators. There was a pile of 6 dead birds next to a mammal burrow that we were able to locate. But so we do know they're getting depredated, but things seem to have leveled off. And now we're hoping they're going to try to start breeding. So they're calling, there are quail calling in Pennsylvania again. And we'll see. So this project's going to run for 3 years. They're trying to translocate about 100 birds a year. And try to get a population established there. Where you see on this image, all these trees and things, that's all gone actually. In the last 2 years, they've cleared all of that and turned it all back into early successional grassland habitat. They've got these huge pollinator fields. So they're trying to manage for very large scale grassland habitat. That's benefiting a lot of other species too. Like I said, we have meadowlarks that are nesting, and there's grasshopper sparrows, there's red-headed woodpeckers, there's lots of other interesting grassland species. So I think I'll stop there.